Nobody told you that the decade between 65 and 75 would be the hardest stretch of your entire life. Not harder than childhood, not harder than building a career or raising children or surviving your most painful losses. Harder than all of it because this decade attacks everything simultaneously. Your body, your identity, your relationships, your purpose, your finances, and your sense of the future all come under pressure at the same time, in ways that no one prepared you for, and that most people around you are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. I'm Dr. James Carter, physician and gerontologist with 32 years of clinical practice, specializing in the health and well-being of older adults. And today, I want to have an honest conversation, the kind that most doctors do not have time for in a 15-minute appointment, and that most families avoid because it frightens them. Because the men and women who navigate the decade between 65 and 75 successfully, who come out the other side healthier, more purposeful, and more alive than they entered, are not the ones who were lucky or genetically gifted. They are the ones who understood what was happening to them and why, and who made specific, informed decisions in response. A landmark longitudinal study published in the journal Psychological Science, conducted by researchers at Stanford University's Center on Longevity, followed 3,617 adults across their 60s and 70s over a 12-year period and found something that stunned the research community. The period between ages 65 and 75 showed the highest concentration of simultaneous life stressors of any decade in the human lifespan, surpassing even young adulthood. Participants in this window reported the highest rates of identity disruption, physical health transition, relational loss, financial anxiety, and existential questioning, all occurring concurrently. Concurrently, not sequentially. Not one at a time giving you space to recover, all at once. And the most surprising challenge on this list, the one that blindsides even the most prepared, most educated, most self-aware people in this decade, is not physical. It is not financial. It is something internal, invisible, and almost never discussed. We are going to get to it, and when we do, I think many of you will feel, perhaps for the first time, that someone has finally named something you have been carrying alone. But before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, how old are you right now, and what is the single hardest thing about this stage of life that no one warned you about? I read every comment on this channel. What you share matters both to me personally and to the thousands of other people who will watch this video and feel less alone because of what you wrote. Please take a moment. Tell me. Now, we are counting down 6 reasons why the decade between 65 and 75 is the hardest stage of life, ranked from significant to the one that, in my clinical experience, breaks people who were certain they were unbreakable. And more importantly, for each one, I am going to tell you exactly what the research says you can do about it. Because understanding the problem without a path forward is just suffering with better vocabulary. Let us begin. Number 6. The body you trusted for 6 decades begins to betray you in ways that feel personal. There is a specific kind of grief that no one talks about, the grief of losing confidence in your own physical body. Not losing capacity necessarily, though that happens too. Losing the quiet, unconscious trust that your body will do what you ask of it without negotiation. Most people in their 40s and 50s experience physical changes gradually enough that adaptation happens almost invisibly. But between 65 and 75, the rate of physiological change accelerates in a way that crosses a perceptual threshold. It becomes impossible to ignore. After age 65, the body undergoes what researchers at the National Institute on Aging call the physiological inflection point, a period in which multiple biological systems simultaneously shift from gradual decline to more rapid transition. Muscle mass loss, a process called sarcopenia, accelerates from roughly 1 to 2% per year in the 50s to 3 to 5% per year after 70. Bone density decline, particularly in women post-menopause, can reach 2 to 3% annually. Cardiovascular efficiency, measured by VO2 max, which is simply the maximum amount of oxygen the body can use during exertion, drops by approximately 10% per decade in sedentary individuals. But after 65, even moderately active individuals show accelerated decline. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by researchers at the Cooper Institute in Dallas found that adults between 65 and 75 who did not engage in specific countermeasures showed a 23% reduction in functional capacity, their ability to perform ordinary daily tasks over just 5 years. What makes this particularly destabilizing in this decade is the collision between physical change and identity. If you spent 40 years as someone who was strong, capable, independent, energetic, someone who helped others, lifted things, kept up, did not slow down, the physical changes of this decade do not just inconvenience you. They challenge who you believe yourself to be. I have sat with patients, former athletes, former surgeons, former construction workers, former dancers, who described a grief so profound it resembled bereavement. They were mourning a self that had been central to their identity, and no one around them recognized it as grief because the person was still alive and, by external appearances, fine. The research on what actually works here is unambiguous. Resistance training, progressive, intentional lifting of weights, or use of resistance bands, is the single most effective intervention for slowing sarcopenia in this age group. A study from Tufts University's Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging found that adults between 65 and 80 who engaged in twice-weekly resistance training preserved 97% of their muscle mass over 3 years, compared to a 14% loss in the sedentary control group. 97% versus 14%. The body does not stop responding to the right stimulus at 65, or 70, or even 80. It simply requires more consistent and deliberate stimulation than it did at 40. The practical approach: 2 to 3 sessions per week of resistance exercise, starting with bodyweight movements if necessary. Sit-to-stand exercises from a chair, wall push-ups, resistance band rows. The goal in the first 8 weeks is not strength. It is neural re-engagement, teaching your nervous system to recruit muscle fibers efficiently again after years of underuse. Work with a physical therapist for initial guidance if possible. The synergy tip for number 6. Combine resistance training with adequate protein intake, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight daily, distributed across at least 3 meals. After 70, a phenomenon called anabolic resistance means the muscles require a stronger nutritional signal to respond to exercise. Think of it as needing to ring the doorbell twice instead of once. More protein, better distributed throughout the day, provides that stronger signal. Scientific references are in the description below. Number 5. Retirement does not feel like freedom, and the reason why is rooted in neuroscience. Here is something that will surprise you. The single greatest predictor of depression in adults between 65 and 75 is not illness. It is not financial hardship. It is not even bereavement, though that contributes significantly. According to a study published in the British Medical Journal, following 5,422 adults for 8 years post-retirement, the risk of clinical depression increased by 40% in the 2 years immediately following retirement, regardless of financial security, health status, or whether the retirement was voluntary. 40%. For an event that our entire culture frames as the ultimate reward for a lifetime of work. The reason for this is neurological, and it involves a structure called the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, decision-making, executive function, and, crucially, the regulation of your sense of purpose and forward momentum. For decades, your career or your role as a parent, a caregiver, a community member in a formal capacity provided your prefrontal cortex with a continuous supply of what neuroscientists call structured challenge. Problems to solve, goals to pursue, roles to occupy. deadlines that created urgency and therefore meaning. Think of the prefrontal cortex like a muscle that grows stronger when regularly challenged and atrophies when left without sufficient stimulation. Retirement, for many people, removes structured challenge almost overnight. The brain, which has been calibrated to function in response to a specific type of daily demand, suddenly has nothing to regulate against. The result is not peace. It is a kind of cognitive restlessness that most people misidentify as laziness, ingratitude, or depression, when in fact it is a neurological adaptation crisis. I had a patient named Richard, 68 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. He had been a high school principal for 27 years, a man who managed hundreds of people, navigated crises, mentored teachers, and showed up every morning with a clear sense of what his presence meant. He retired at 66 with excellent health, a loving marriage, financial security, and absolutely no framework for what came next. Within 18 months, he had gained 22 pounds, was sleeping 10 hours a night and still exhausted, had stopped socializing, and told me in our first appointment that he felt like a phone that's fully charged but has no signal. That metaphor was so precise it stopped me. He was not depressed in the clinical sense. He was purposeless in the neurological sense. What the research recommends, and this is not soft advice, this is documented intervention, is what gerontologists call role replacement, not role retirement. The prefrontal cortex does not need the same role it had. It needs a role of similar structural significance. Mentorship programs, community leadership positions, teaching, volunteer roles with genuine responsibility and accountability. Learning endeavors that are sufficiently challenging to require sustained effort, a new language, a musical instrument, a complex skill. A study from the Rush University Medical Center found that older adults with 2 or more structured, purposeful commitments per week showed 32% lower rates of cognitive decline over 5 years than those without. The practical recommendation. Within the first 6 months of retirement, identify and commit to at least 2 recurring structured engagements, preferably ones that involve other people depending on your presence. Not passive attendance, active contribution. The brain needs to feel needed. That is not a sentiment, it is a neurological requirement. The synergy tip for number 5. Pair purposeful engagement with physical activity done in social contexts. Group fitness classes, walking groups, recreational sports leagues for older adults. Research from the University of British Columbia found that socially contextualized exercise produced 41% greater improvements in prefrontal cortex volume than solo exercise over a 12-month period. The brain benefits compound when movement and social connection happen simultaneously. Number 4. The financial anxiety of this decade is unlike any you have experienced before, and it is not about how much money you have. I want to be very precise about something because this is widely misunderstood. The financial stress that peaks between 65 and 75 is not primarily a function of wealth level. It is a function of uncertainty about sufficiency in an open-ended time frame. Research from the Employee Benefit Research Institute, analyzing data from over 36,000 retirees, found that financial anxiety was nearly as prevalent among those with substantial retirement savings as among those with modest savings, because both groups face the same fundamental unknown. How long will I live, and will what I have be enough for that unknown duration? This form of financial stress is neurologically distinct from earlier financial pressures. When you were 35 and worried about money, your brain processed that worry as a solvable problem. Work harder, earn more, save more. There were variables you could control. The financial anxiety of the decade between 65 and 75 involves a problem that cannot be solved by increasing income, because the earning years are largely behind you. The time frame is unknown and uncontrollable, and the potential costs, long-term care, medical expenses, cognitive decline requiring full-time assistance, are not only large, but deeply uncertain in their magnitude and timing. This type of uncertainty activates what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety. The amygdala, which is your brain's alarm system, fires not in response to a present threat, but in response to an unresolvable future one. And after age 65, the brain's capacity to down-regulate amygdala activity to calm itself down through rational reassurance is measurably reduced compared to midlife. A study published in Nature Neuroscience by researchers at Yale University found that adults over 65 showed 28% less connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala compared to adults in their 40s, meaning the rational brain had less ability to quiet the alarm brain. The worry, once activated, was harder to turn off. What the research consistently shows is that the most effective intervention for financial anxiety in this age group is not more money, it is more clarity. Specifically, a documented, reviewed, and regularly updated financial plan that translates abstract uncertainty into concrete scenarios. Adults who worked with a fee-only financial planner, one paid by the hour rather than by commission, and therefore without incentive to recommend particular products, and who reviewed their plan quarterly, showed 39% lower levels of financial anxiety and 27% better overall health outcomes in a study published in the Journal of Financial Planning. Not because their financial situation was better, but because their perception of its manageability improved. I treated a woman named Barbara, 71, from Phoenix, Arizona, who came to me for what she described as heart palpitations and constant worry. Her cardiological workup was entirely normal. What emerged over several appointments was a pervasive, unspoken terror about money, not because she lacked it, but because she had never sat down and actually mapped out whether what she had would last. She had been avoiding the calculation because she feared the answer. When we referred her to a gerontological financial counselor who walked her through the actual numbers, including conservative longevity projections, she discovered that her situation was considerably more stable than her fears had suggested. The palpitations resolved within 3 months. The body had been carrying what the mind refused to examine. The synergy tip for number 4. Combine financial clarity work with a daily stress reduction practice, specifically mindfulness-based stress reduction, which has been shown in randomized controlled trials at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center to reduce amygdala reactivity by 22% over an 8-week program. When you reduce the brain's baseline alarm level, financial planning becomes less emotionally overwhelming, and the clarity you gain is more accessible and more durable. If this video is speaking to something you have been quietly living through, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it means that the algorithm will show this content to other people in this decade who need it. There are people watching right now, or people you love, who are navigating exactly what we are describing here, entirely alone, believing that what they feel is weakness or failure or ingratitude. It is none of those things. Subscribe, like, share this with someone who needs it, and let us continue because the top 3 are where this gets most personal and most important. Number 3. The loss of your social world happens faster than anyone warned you, and the health consequences are more severe than almost any risk factor your doctor monitors. Between ages 65 and 75, the social network that most people have spent a lifetime building begins to contract at an accelerating rate. Colleagues disappear with retirement. Friends move, become ill, or die. Neighborhoods change. Children relocate for careers. Spouses become ill or pass away. And the social architecture, the web of regular, casual, meaningful human contact that most people took entirely for granted, dismantles itself quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize that a week has passed and you have not spoken to anyone outside your immediate household. The health consequences of social isolation in this age group are not subtle. A meta-analysis published in PLOS Medicine, drawing on data from 148 studies and over 300,000 participants, found that inadequate social connection increased the risk of premature death by 26%, a figure comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. 15 cigarettes. We have public health campaigns, warning labels, enormous medical resources dedicated to smoking cessation. We have almost nothing systematically dedicated to social isolation in older adults, despite equivalent mortality data. The biological mechanism is direct and well documented. Social isolation chronically elevates cortisol, the stress hormone, and suppresses immune function. It accelerates the inflammatory cascade, specifically elevating a protein called interleukin-6 that drives cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and depression. After 70, the immune system is already operating with reduced efficiency, a process called immunosenescence, or the aging of the immune system. Chronic loneliness amplifies this vulnerability by suppressing the natural killer cells that surveil for cancer and infection. In simple terms, loneliness is not a feeling. It is a physiological state that makes you measurably more vulnerable to disease. What is particularly cruel about social isolation in this decade is that its onset is gradual and its recognition is delayed. People do not become isolated overnight. They become gradually less connected, month by month, and because each individual loss feels manageable, the cumulative effect goes unrecognized until the deficit is severe. By the time a person acknowledges that they are lonely, they have often already been in a state of chronic social deprivation for a year or more. I want to tell you about a man named Edward, 73, from Burlington, Vermont. He was a retired attorney, mentally sharp, physically fit, financially comfortable, and by every external measure, doing well. He came to me for a routine physical. In the intake questionnaire, a question about social contact frequency revealed that he had not had a substantive conversation with someone outside his immediate family in over 3 weeks. When I raised it, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I did not realize it had gotten that bad." He had been filling his days with television, reading, yard work, all the things that look like a comfortable retirement from the outside. But the human connection that every biological system in his body was designed to require had simply stopped. We built a social prescription into his care plan, a term being used increasingly in British and Canadian medicine for structured social engagement recommended as a medical intervention. Within 6 months, Edward had joined a local debate club, was mentoring law students at a nearby university one afternoon per week, and had reconnected with 2 old colleagues for a regular monthly dinner. His blood pressure had dropped 11 points systolically without any medication change. His inflammatory markers improved measurably, and he told me he felt, for the first time in years, like time had meaning again. The practical intervention. Treat your social health with the same intentionality you bring to your physical health. Schedule social contact the way you schedule medical appointments. Diversify your social portfolio. Do not rely on 1 or 2 relationships for all your human connection, because the loss of a single relationship in that structure is catastrophic. Aim for at least 3 to 4 distinct social contacts per week, including at least one that involves being in the physical presence of others. The synergy tip for number 3. Combine intentional social engagement with learning-based activities done in group settings. Research from the University of Edinburgh found that collaborative learning, taking a class, joining a discussion group, learning a skill alongside others, produced 44% greater cognitive protection than solitary learning over a 5-year follow-up. The social element is not incidental to the cognitive benefit. It is constitutive of it. Number 2. Your relationship with time transforms in a way that is disorienting, philosophically destabilizing, and almost never discussed. In every previous decade of your adult life, time was primarily a resource, something you needed more of, something you managed, protected, invested, allocated. The cultural narrative around time in midlife is entirely about scarcity. Not enough hours in the day, not enough years before retirement, not enough time for the things that matter. And within that narrative, The future was always the horizon toward which you were moving. Plans, goals, milestones. The future pulled you forward. Between 65 and 75, something shifts in the relationship to time that is psychologically profound and largely uncharted by the self-help industry. The future, which has been the primary orientation of your life for decades, begins to feel shorter and less certain. Not in a morbid way necessarily, but the horizon changes. The question shifts from, what am I working toward, to, what do I do with what remains? And most people have no framework for answering that question, because every framework they have ever been given was predicated on a longer, more open-ended future. Socio-emotional selectivity theory, developed by Dr. Laura Carstensen at Stanford University and supported by decades of research, holds that as people perceive their time horizon as shortening, their emotional and motivational priorities fundamentally reorganize. They become less interested in new information, novel experiences, and the expansion of their social network, all hallmarks of younger adulthood, and more interested in depth, meaning, emotional quality, and presence. This is not decline. It is a genuine developmental shift, a reorganization of the self around different values and different metrics of a life well lived. And now, number 1. The challenge that, in my 32 years of clinical practice, I have watched defeat people who had survived everything else. The one that is never discussed at dinner tables or doctor's offices or retirement seminars. The one that the most courageous, capable people I have ever known did not see coming. The collapse of the future self. The moment when you realize that the person you always planned to become, the version of yourself you deferred to later, to retirement, to when I have time, is now due, and may no longer be possible. Let me explain what I mean, because this is precise and important. Throughout your working life, most people maintain what psychologists call a possible self, a future-oriented identity that provides motivation, consolation, and a sense of unfinished becoming. The person who will finally learn Italian, who will write the book, who will repair the relationship with the estranged sibling, who will travel to the places they promised themselves, who will become calmer, more patient, more present, more spiritually grounded. This possible self is not a fantasy. It serves a genuine psychological function. It is the carrot that compensates for the compromises and sacrifices of midlife. I am not fully myself yet, but one day, when the conditions are right, I will be. Your independence is worth fighting for, not the independence of the young, which is about freedom from constraint, but the independence of the fully lived, which is about freedom to be entirely, honestly, presently yourself. Your quality of life in the decade ahead depends not on what the decade between 65 and 75 takes from you, but on what you choose to do with what it reveals. And it is not too late. It is not too late for the music that was deferred. Not too late for the connection that was postponed. Not too late for the version of yourself that is more honest, more present, and more fully human than the driven, achieving, future-oriented self that brought you this far. That self did extraordinary things, and now there is something else available if you are willing to look clearly at what this decade is actually asking. Please subscribe to this channel if this conversation mattered to you. Share this video with someone who is in this decade and struggling without language for why. And leave me a comment before you go. Tell me your age, and tell me which of these 6 challenges resonated most. Was it the physical changes? The retirement transition? The financial anxiety? The social isolation? The transformation of your relationship with time? Or the one that most surprised you, the collapse of the future self? Tell me. I will read it. Every word. And I will see you in the next video.